The Consensus Wars by John Kitchen. Copyright 2025. All rights reserved. This is a work of hybrid fiction that was created in an iterative process using multimodal large language models. Any resemblance to any person, place, or institution, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Chapter 5. The Network Effect. 6 months after Millfield, Elena stood before a wall-mounted display in Serg's warehouse that looked like mission control at NASA, if NASA were tracking beliefs instead of spacecraft. Dozens of monitors showed real-time data streams from 12 communities where they were running scaled interventions, each one a living laboratory for testing theories about how minds changed. "We're not thinking big enough," Dr. Alex Petroff announced, pulling up a visualization that made Elena's breath catch. The display showed interconnected networks spanning multiple states, with information flowing between communities like a vast circulatory system of ideas. Individual minds aren't the real target, Alex continued, manipulating the visualization to highlight certain pathways. Social networks are. Beliefs don't exist in individual brains. They exist in the connections between brains. Elena moved closer to the screen, recognizing the mathematical elegance of what Alex was showing. It was network theory, applied to the epidemiology of ideas, tracking how beliefs propagated through social systems the same way diseases spread through populations. "Look at this," Maya said, highlighting a cluster of nodes in rural Colorado. "We successfully increased vaccine acceptance in this community by 30%. But watch what happened next." The visualization shifted to show information flows over time. The improved vaccine attitudes in the targeted community began spreading to neighboring communities through existing social connections, family members who lived in other towns, high school friends who'd moved away, business relationships that crossed county lines. "Secondary propagation," Sarah breathed. "We treated one community, but the effect spread to communities we never touched." "Exactly," Alex said. "But here's the really interesting part." The visualization shifted again, showing a different pattern. In some cases, the secondary propagation continued spreading scientific acceptance, but in other cases, it triggered what Alex called immune responses, coordinated pushback from opposing belief networks that had detected the intervention. "The anti-vaccine networks adapted," Lisa explained, pulling up social media data. "They identified our approach in Millfield and developed counter-strategies. They started training their own trusted local voices, using our techniques to spread misinformation." Elena felt a chill of recognition. They weren't just studying belief networks, they were participating in an arms race between competing information ecosystems. "Show her the fossil fuel analysis?" Sarah said grimly. Alex pulled up a new set of visualizations, these ones tracking climate change discussions across social networks. The patterns were sobering. Well-funded climate denial organizations were already using sophisticated network analysis to identify and influence key nodes in local communities. "They're ahead of us," Alex said. "They figured out years ago that individual persuasion doesn't scale, but network effects do. They've been systematically identifying and recruiting trusted local voices in strategically important communities." Elena studied the data, recognizing familiar patterns from her atmospheric modeling work. Just as climate systems had tipping points, where small changes could trigger massive shifts, Belief systems had similar dynamics. Influence the right nodes at the right time, and you could reshape entire networks. So what do we do? She asked. Sarah moved to another whiteboard, covered with what looked like military strategic planning. We scale faster and smarter. We develop systematic methods for identifying key influencers in communities, train them more effectively, and create self-sustaining networks of scientific advocacy. That's not research anymore, Elena said. What is that? Applied epistemology, offered Maya. The systematic engineering of knowledge propagation through social networks. Elena stared at the strategic diagrams, recognizing elements from her own field: cascade theory, network dynamics, complex systems analysis, but applied to human communities instead of atmospheric or oceanic systems. It was elegant and terrifying. What about consent? She asked. These communities don't know they're subjects in our experiments. Are patients in a hospital subjects in medical experiments when doctors use evidence-based treatments? Rajesh countered. We're applying scientifically validated methods to improve public health outcomes. The alternative is leaving communities vulnerable to misinformation campaigns that are definitely not seeking their consent. The ethical arguments had been circling for months without resolution. Elena found herself caught between competing moral frameworks: the research ethics that demanded informed consent, and the public health ethics that sometimes justified intervention without explicit permission. Her phone buzzed with a call from Dr. Margaret Thompson. Elena hesitated before answering, knowing that her former mentor had been tracking Serg's activities with growing alarm. Elena. Thompson's voice was crisp with disapproval. We need to talk. Doctor. Thompson, I know you have concerns about our work. Concerns. Thompson's voice rose. Elena, I've been reviewing your publications from this organization. You're not doing science. You're doing mass manipulation. Elena stepped away from the team, moving toward a quieter corner of the warehouse. We're applying scientific methods to understand how scientific information can be more effectively communicated. By deceiving people about your intentions, by treating human communities like laboratory rats, by abandoning every ethical principle that legitimate research is built on. The communities are benefiting, Elena said, though she heard the defensiveness in her own voice. Vaccination rates are up, science literacy is improving. At what cost? You're proving that beliefs can be manipulated by anyone with sufficient psychological sophistication. Do you have any idea what you've unleashed? Elena looked back at the wall of monitors. The network visualizations showing belief systems spreading and shifting like weather fronts across invisible landscapes of human connection. Thompson was right. They had unleashed something unprecedented. What would you have us do instead? Elena asked. Continue publishing papers that nobody reads while misinformation spreads unchecked? Watch scientific institutions lose all credibility while people die from preventable diseases? I would have you maintain your integrity, Thompson said coldly. Science doesn't need to be popular to be valuable. Truth doesn't require consensus to remain true. But it requires acceptance to be useful, Elena shot back. Climate change is real whether people believe it or not, but people's beliefs determine whether we do anything about it. The conversation ended with both women more convinced of their positions than before. A perfect example of the belief entrenchment that Serg's research had documented extensively. Elena returned to the team, who had continued developing their scaling strategy. On the main screen, Alex was showing network models for targeting climate change denial in key swing communities that could influence state and federal climate policy. We identify the top 50 communities with the highest climate influence to persuasion ratios, he explained. Places where relatively small belief changes could have outsized political effects. Then we deploy targeted interventions using locally trusted messengers. How long would something like this take? Elena asked. 18 months to show measurable attitude shifts. 3 years to potentially flip enough communities to change federal climate policy. Elena stared at the timeline, thinking about her atmospheric research, showing that they had perhaps a decade to prevent the worst climate outcomes. Traditional academic timelines, publish, review, replicate, gradually build consensus, operated on scales of decades. They didn't have decades. What about the ethical review process? She asked. Sarah pulled up another document. We've been in discussions with several IRBs about approving large-scale network interventions for public health purposes. It's complicated. Meaning the ethical frameworks for human subjects research weren't designed for interventions at the scale of entire social networks. We're in uncharted territory. Elena felt the weight of being pioneers in a field that might reshape how science interacted with society, or might destroy the credibility that scientific institutions had spent centuries building. There's something else, Alex said quietly, pulling up a final visualization. We're not the only ones doing this anymore. The screen showed similar network intervention patterns in communities across 3 countries. The signature was unmistakable. Sophisticated analysis of social networks, targeted deployment of trusted local messengers, careful tracking of belief propagation through connected populations. Who? Elena asked. We don't know for certain, but the techniques are too similar to be coincidental. Someone else has figured out how to engineer belief change at scale, and they're already deploying it. Elena stared at the evidence of a global information war that most people didn't even know was happening. Competing teams of social scientists and data analysts using the same tools that Serg had developed, fighting for control of what entire populations believed about science, politics, reality itself. They had wanted to save scientific credibility by making it more persuasive. Instead, they had accelerated the weaponization of persuasion itself. The question now was whether they could stay ahead of the forces they had unleashed, or whether they had already lost control of their own innovation. Outside the warehouse, Oakland hummed with normal life. People going to work, sending children to school, making decisions based on beliefs they assumed were their own. None of them knew that those beliefs were increasingly the product of sophisticated engineering by organizations they'd never heard of, using techniques they couldn't imagine. Elena wondered if that was a feature of the new information ecosystem or a bug. She was beginning to suspect it might be both. Elena felt the weight of decisions settling on her shoulders. They could continue working at small scales, community by community, building evidence for their methods while climate change accelerated beyond control. Or they could scale up immediately, potentially changing the course of climate policy, but abandoning traditional ethical safeguards in the process. There's something else, Alex said, pulling up a final visualization that made Elena's blood run cold. The screen showed network analysis of conspiracy theory propagation over the past 5 years. The patterns were identical to their own successful interventions, but operating in reverse. Sophisticated psychological operations designed to spread misinformation through trusted local voices in strategic communities. They're already doing what we're doing, Alex said. Except they're doing it to spread lies instead of truth. The question isn't whether we should use these techniques. The question is whether we're going to let the other side use them unopposed. Elena looked around at her team, former academics who'd sacrificed traditional careers to develop new methods for defending truth in an age of weaponized information. Outside the warehouse, the sun was setting over Oakland, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, networks of minds were processing information, forming beliefs, making decisions that would determine the future of the planet. The consensus wars had begun, whether they participated or not. The only question was, which side would prove more scientifically sophisticated? All right, Elena said finally. Show me the scale-up plan.